And the remarks. Yeah, please.
Thank you. May I say a very enjoyable presentation and a very rich one. I'd like to introduce a slightly different angle, and I do it by means of a noted philosopher, Humpty Dumpty, in Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass. As you will know, he said, when I use a word, it means what I want it to mean. And for me, that's the stance of authority. You know, in public life, in political debate, as you've mentioned in various different contexts, governors, rulers want to make their interpretation of these sources stick. And I've always seen myself as a Marxist, always seen Marx as challenging that perspective in a very productive way by drawing attention to why it is that particular ideas flourish at particular times. And that's a dimension you didn't address. You're addressing it in a not a timeless context, but you didn't ask the question, it wasn't your question, why were these particular ideas prominent at that particular time, and why were they used by the people who used them for the purposes for which they used them? So I'd just like to ask you to comment on that question. Why were those ideas shown as you've described it? What purpose did they serve? And is there any emancipatory power in the materialist analysis that says the ruling ideas of the time are the ideas of the ruling class?
Yes, maybe I did not explicitly address that question. I should also say then from the beginning that although I would not describe myself as a Marxist, still I very much share your view that the question that you said was absent from my talk is a very important and relevant one. And actually I only had 50 minutes, long 50 minutes perhaps, but still. And as I see it, by introducing Karl Popper's three worlds, and by insisting that ideas can play a role, can have a function only insofar as they are interpreted. I also mentioned that if we are to understand how an idea is interpreted, we must look at other circumstances than the content of the text itself. I was speaking about the situation in which we find ourselves, our interests, our mindsets, and so on. And by saying this, I think we opened up for the Marxist perspective, which you perhaps feel that I could have given greater scope in my talk. No, I very much agree with you, and that this is a very important perspective. And I must say that one of the reasons why I enjoy Dydron quite a lot is that I think he opens up for this, but he's still blind to a few things. He thinks that he doesn't really see how he hasn't read, he doesn't know Humpty Dumpty. He should have benefited a lot from Lewis Carroll. He doesn't quite understand that. But what he does see is the ideological use to which ideas are put. And for us, as looking at Chinese history from today, from the point of view of today, it's very obvious that Li Xie became a tool in the hands of the rulers. And that Dydron had a point when he said that they defined Li in such a way that Li became equivalent to the interests of the power holders. This is a thesis of Dydron. Maybe I did not make this sufficiently clear, but I absolutely share that judgment. Li Xie was used as a tool of oppression, and this was the way it was done in this way was that Li was defined to be equivalent to the interests of the rulers. And I also think that, I mean, as I said, both Dydron and Wang Yangming's followers in the politically more radical Taizhou school saw this oppressive function. And philosophically, they proposed two different solutions. The Taidro-Pai wanted to go in a subjectivist direction, saying that only if we have the right to define what is right and true within ourselves can we escape this oppressive function. Whereas Daedron sought a more objectivistic alternative. And in the choice between these alternatives, my philosophical choice is Daedron's. I think that we must seek. I mean, there are many things for which there can be perhaps no objective criteria, but I think we should exert ourselves to find objective criteria. And therefore I sympathize with Daedron, and I sympathize with his skepticism about dualism. I was not, you raised the question in a more perhaps directly political way than I did, but certainly my personal predilection is also for a more monist worldview. But I think even you as a Marxist must admit that dualistic or philosophical orientations have not only played a conservative role in history. There are many instances where such ideas which we may dislike for some reasons, but still they have been progressive. So when we think about whether to adopt or reject them, I think we should, for the time being, leave their functions aside and concentrate on their intellectual core content. And then I should be in all humility, I should not sound too certain of myself, but my own inclination is to go for a more monistic, if you will, materialist orientation.
Yeah, Professor Zhang.
I think this is a very rich lecture, and of course covers a lot of ground and history, because you mentioned Wang Yangmin as a background, slightly of Daedron's critique of them, and also later you talked about Zhu Xi and the idea. The interesting, particularly this exchange of question and answer, I think the interesting issue is that sometimes the idea of a philosopher or thinker, when it becomes explained and interpreted by followers, would turn into something totally different. I mean, Zhu Xi thought he was doing something. In my view, in comparative philosophy, I would think Zhu Xi is very much like Martin Luther was doing, because he was very much against the Han commentary tradition, thought that they had distorted the texts. And therefore, this is not Zhu Xi, but many of the Song scholars, beginning with Ouyang Xiu and many others, wanted to return to the original text and understand the meaning. And as you say, sometimes they impose their own understanding as the correct understanding, but that's inevitable. But then the later Song, Wang Yangmin, and particularly from the Qin dynasty point of view, many of the scholars, with Gu Yanwu and all that, thought that the Song dynasty declined because of this sort of too abstract subjective views, and they wanted to go to really the more of the monistic. So I think Daedron's critique is very powerful precisely for that reason. They go back to the text and thinking of the followers of Wang Yangmin had done, so subjective that they didn't really have a ground in many of the things. So I think that you have to differentiate this, the idea and the followers. And Marxism would be a very good example, because Marx, before he died, he said, I'm not a Marxist, because he doesn't want to associate himself with his followers, because the interpretation of Marxism was so far away from what he intended.
Now, at this stage, I would only like to remind you of the main idea behind my talk this afternoon, which was really to say that the linkage that these French scholars, André Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy, made between basic philosophical orientations and political practice, that it cannot really be upheld. It is mistaken. And I think this is what Lungzi just said now, in other words, also, that the same set of ideas can be used for widely different purposes. So this is my main point. And then on top of that, I also wanted to add that, to my view still, in my view still, there is such a thing as the true content of ideas.
Another question? One time, two time, three. Thank you very much. Okay. We have a small gift for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.